Hello everyone. So I wanted to do a quick video covering the hearings with Amy Coney Barrett for the Supreme Court. And before we get into the specifics, I just want to address the notion of whether the Democrats should have even gone to the hearings. I had heard I guess towards the end of the hearings on the last day, not a lot of Democrats showed up, but I think they should have been more steadfast and perhaps not have shown up at all. Because, I mean, on one level, it doesn't really make sense to say that this is a sham hearing and that this is illegitimate and the Republicans are basically jamming this justice through and that's not right. It doesn't make sense to say that and then take in part of the process. So and when we talk about what happened with 2016, you know, the Republicans didn't even hold a hearing again for Merrick Garland for practically a year. And so if people want to say, it's oh, if the Democrats didn't show up to these hearings, they're going to be just viewed as quitters and oh gosh, they're so terrible. Well, if you can't make that argument about the Republicans just completely holding out for basically a year and not even holding a hearing, not even letting it come up for a vote, just basically abandoning their role in the Senate to review and vote on the nominee. They wouldn't even do that. But it's just there's so many missed opportunities all the time. With the Democrats, it's just they don't focus on blatant hypocrisy, on very important issues such as Roe v. Wade. I feel like they were really. It's you heard it come up. I heard Dianne Feinstein question Amy Coney Barrett about it, and she was like, "Oh well, I'm not really pleased with your answer." Well, it's you're not doing a very good job, anyways, at trying to get at it. I feel like it's just that there's at the end of the day, should they have taken part in the hearings? In my opinion, I think they would have been better suited to not take part in it, and they would have diverted attention away from the hearings, and they could have reframed the narrative more. Because, again, it's if you're going to make the point that it's a sham and then you don't take part in what's going on, people start to question that, and you're going to get people that buy into it just by virtue of the fact that you're presenting it as such. So, it's just, I feel on a strategic political level, this should be very basic stuff. Especially, especially with the context of 2016 and how that court seat was stolen, essentially. I mean, that's the way I would view this, honestly. It's either Gorsuch, his seat was stolen, or Barrett's seat was stolen in this case. It's just, I don't know how you can get around that, just because the Republicans, they withheld, and their strategy worked. So, credit where it's due, I guess. But, okay, so largely, though, there's just too much political theater, and this is a huge problem with these hearings in general, is it's always all the time just these indirect answers and I can't answer on this if I'm going to decide on a case pertaining to this. It's I'm sorry, it's just I know that these traditions come into play for a reason, at least in the context of just how we have our system set up and how it's changed over time, because I mean, Supreme Court hearings have become more politicized, I would say, in recent decades. So it's just, it goes against common sense to have these people answering in the way that they are, because it's just very vague, and we all can kind of read into it what we already believe, honestly, just based because there's hardly any substance. It's just, again, with Roe v. Wade, like I don't think Barrett gave a really satisfying answer. Um, but on the other side, yeah, like Dianne Feinstein could have worded it a little bit better. I would say. I think it could have been more effective if it was kind of framed in a way so that she could answer, like saying like, "Will you commit to not overturning Roe v. Wade?" Because like if it makes it, if you kind of make the person speak in more negative terms, then people come away with that impression that it's going to basically impact their lives, and it does in this case. It is going to impact, women's lives and women's autonomy over their body. It should be such a simple issue. It's just like I don't even, I hardly get why abortion is that complicated of an issue. Just because like we already have these restrictions in a lot of ways in this country. It's up to the states really. It's whatever the state allows to be lawful to them, and they can be much more restrictive about it and make it extremely hard for women to try and get an abortion if they feel they need to. And so it becomes a question of privilege then, whether you're in the position to do that, and if you're not someone of privilege, then you're going to be screwed then, and then you're in a cycle of having babies that you probably don't even want maybe. So my larger point to that is just like, yeah, like why is the government, why do conservatives suddenly drop this notion of, oh, I don't want the government like marching into my life and telling me what to do, but then they suddenly drop that when it comes to abortion. It just, I don't understand that, because it has to be, we have viability in this country. We do. It's up to a certain point we allow abortions, and then in very rare cases, like in a medical necessity, based on if the mother might be in danger of dying, or maybe the baby, any number of things. But to act like it's just wanton craziness, like Wild West, a woman can do whatever she wants, like, no, I mean, that's not even really true, because the doctors, they have to approve what goes on. It's not like people just walk in requesting a late-term abortion out of nowhere. Like, it's just this way of viewing it is such a hyperbole. It's not really rooted in how things actually happen and unfold. But just the larger principle, like, I don't get why government has to make these rules in this way for women, and basically act like they have a say over how they should live their lives and make it harder for them. But of course, that's always such a hard issue. It's a social issue, and it's going to be, you have religion to contend with. There's a lot of different angles to abortion, I suppose. But there's even though I don't really agree with the Democrats taking part in this process, because ultimately it's just like, I don't feel like it did much. I mean, like, she's going to probably get voted in, and we'll talk about how that's going to unfold, I guess, towards the end. But just overall, the Democrats had some decent moments in highlighting why Amy Coney Barrett's potential decisions could affect, the health care of millions of Americans. And just like to follow up on the Roe v. Wade thing, she signed 2 anti-abortion ads, calling Roe v. Wade an infamous decision, and it's basically like saying it should be overturned. So I don't get how this doesn't get pointed out and just talked about relentlessly. And just like to add on top of that, like the principle of what's going on, I feel like, and it's such hypocrisy to me, is that I just wish we could all be honest and act like, and all recognize that we're all putting activists on the court. It's like, stop dancing around the fact like, oh, we're going to be nonpartisan, we're going to follow the letter of the law and precedent, and it's like, no, you're putting activists on the Supreme Court, and people who are, I mean, like the Democrats are not left wing by any stretch of the imagination, so don't get it twisted. Okay, but who they pick is going to be more in line, I guess, with neoliberal centrism, or kind of like you could say moderate as well. So, I mean, center left at best. I mean, I wouldn't even say that. I would just say pure centrist is what like a Democrat would choose. Merrick Garland was is about as centrist, like moderate a choice as you could possibly have. I mean, Orrin Hatch, who was on the Senate at the time, I believe, in Utah, um, he was like praising Garland, saying like he could be um, confirmed to the Supreme Court like weeks before Obama nominated him, and he said like you probably won't even pick Garland, and then he did. So you can't. It's like the hypocrisy that goes into these things. People don't pay attention. They forget about these things. Honestly, it's just crazy. But yeah, so with the Roe v. Wade thing, yeah, like we're she is an act. She is obviously a conservative activist. She was picked up and put on like the lower courts by Trump like before. I saw it in a documentary that Michael Moore made, Fahrenheit 11/9, and I was like actually surprised to see her like before any of this happened, before she was considered for the Supreme Court, and just like that was crazy to me. Like, but regardless, yeah, it's like if Bernie was in office, I would want him to pick progressive people that would decide things in a way that would be for the betterment of everyone, that would help everyone. So I guess like yeah, at the end of the day, like my view is less strict constitutionalism. Um, to be honest, I think there's a lot of cases you can make in the Constitution probably already. I mean, what's that clause? It's like like the welfare of the people, like so something like that. I freaking forget how that clause goes, but just yeah, like you could kind of make an argument to provide for people in a basic way in this society. Yeah, we should have Medicare for all as one example. Um, but I mean, at the end of the day, I'm not that tied to reformism in the sense that like we have to stick only to the Constitution. We can't look anything beyond that. I think that's just kind of silly and narrow-minded to think that this system should last forever and that it will last forever. I mean, just like empires rise and fall, and we're an empire, so we gotta call it for what it is. Um, but okay, so let's get to some of these nuance moments of the hearings. Um, yeah, so Dianne Feinstein and severability as it applies to the ACA and the individual mandate. Um, Barrett's answer was not really good. I mean, so what they're talking about is essentially if you remove a vital piece of legislation, can the rest of that legislation stand if it's such like a vital piece that without it might not like mean anything, something along those lines. And it's these kind of like legal loopholes that will allow them to completely repeal the ACA, because I mean they've gotten a lot of the stuff out of the ACA already. Like I actually didn't realize the Medicaid expansion is in danger. I don't know for sure if it's been repealed yet, to be honest. But I think it's working its way up in the courts. I know the individual mandate is gone, and pre-existing conditions. There's court cases right now with the Republicans trying to get rid of pre-existing conditions. So this idea of severability, I mean, Barrett's answer was basically that the justices can read into Congress's intentions, and so therefore it's like if you take out this part of the legislation, you're assuming that Congress won't want the rest of it as well without this piece. So that just seems very that's very brazenly kind of saying you're an activist in my mind. It's just reading into Congress's intentions and saying like we're going to get rid of the rest of the ACA in this case because of the individual mandate being repealed. It's just crazy to me because people there's so much of this wonkiness that I feel like people get lost in, and they don't. It's like they can't talk about that, so they talk about um, just the really bare like reality TV like aspects to it, and just like, oh, like this was a crazy moment here, and like this made a lot of noise here, like just I think people are mostly set in their ways, so we're in an era now where there's a lot of polarization in our politics. So I think it's like you're most likely to be on the extremes of either side now, more or less. I mean, I just feel like the center is more or less becoming a smaller camp of people involved in politics. I really do. It's the more elitist type people because they view Trump as kind of just too wild and out there, and like he's really obscene and like crazy on Twitter. So it's like the moderates, I think, get behind a lot of the Trump policies more so than they would let on, to be honest. Especially like if you're talking about Mitt Romney. I mean, oh my gosh, we'll talk about him later. But just yeah, like the moderates overall, they are very right wing. Even if you're like so-called liberal, a moderate liberal, um, and so it's like if you're at that point where you're just kind of like the far left is just as bad as the far right, yeah, I think that's ridiculous because to act like the far left has any power right now. I mean, Biden and Kamala are not far left at all. They aren't going to do these things, the Green New Deal. They're hesitant to even say that they're for the Green New Deal. And you think they're going to do it? Like, to act like these people are socialist is laughable to me. So, it just is crazy to think that Antifa, these far leftists, because like if you really want to talk about like who the far left is, okay, I'll acknowledge that they exist. It's like not just an idea, like Joe said, that's ridiculous. Um, but right, they exist, but they're not going to wield any power. The far right, there's people with positions of power that are causing chaos. I mean, look at Mike Pompeo with foreign policy. We're talking about now like a foreign, I'm sorry, like a Middle East peace deal right now, or like we're getting out of the wars. Like they're so. Are you kidding me? Like we're still there. Get us out now. It's like you could have done this any time throughout your 4 years, Trump. It's like, but they really buy into it and they think like it's happening. It's like, oh, there's going to be peace. Meanwhile, we're waging economic warfare on Iran, by the way. We're blocking medicine from going in there and it's killing people. So, and there's all kinds of things that we're doing with Iran just because like we're even going after our allies. Like if they do business with Iran, then we're going to sanction them too, the European countries. So we're being very hawkish. So don't get it twisted. Like we're not some peaceful like dove. We don't have that president right now. Like Trump is not getting us out of these wars. It's just all talk. So don't buy into that. All right, but I'm getting pretty sidetracked here. So yeah, just like this the severability thing. Yeah, like I don't think Barrett's answer was really good with that because she's basically saying, yeah, like we can go after wherever we want. If we get a victory in this respect and take a chunk out of the ACA, then yeah, it's like we're gonna go after the whole thing and just say like without this piece, the whole thing doesn't work. It's unconstitutional, so we get rid of it. And I just don't see how people cannot realize that's like essentially activism on the court. It's reading their intentions into the law, whatever they think applies to this legislation in terms of the Constitution. I mean, I know that they're supposed to apply certain standards according to the law, and they study this stuff. Obviously, it's like I know I'm not an expert on this, but where I come down to is if it's going to affect millions of Americans' lives, if they can't have access to health care, that's more important to me than whether it's constitutional according to the letter of the law. That's where I draw the line. I'm sorry. Like that's where I feel like is the morally correct position. But okay, let's move on to Abood versus Detroit Board of Education, and Sheldon Whitehouse questioned Amy Coney Barrett on this. And I mean, she was acting aloof that whole time, like she didn't even know what he was talking about. I mean, he laid it out pretty well for her, and it was a pretty good moment, I would say, where he talked about what this court case meant, and it was a whole saga of cases that kind of it illustrates how the behind the scenes of these court cases really work, because they kind of get certain cases that are going to lead to a certain conclusion that judges and justices, like, they're trying to achieve, honestly. Like, they have a view of the country and they want to see that enacted. But okay, so as it applies to this particular case, Abood, it has to do with the unions and how they have agency fees. So you can be a member of a union, and, or I'm sorry, the union can essentially help you with your job. You don't have to necessarily be a member of the union, but the union essentially helps you get better rights, so on and so forth, and benefits. So the union is fighting for you, but you're not necessarily a member, so that they can charge certain agency fees. And so that's what that court case was about, and that helped strengthen the power of unions. And that's by and large a good thing. Like unions can be corrupt, that's certainly true. But I think by and large, unions having more power to leverage, again, better benefits, better rights for their workers, I think that's a better situation for people. And Sheldon Whitehouse laid out how there was these series of cases where Justice Alito was mostly offering like the dissent and like kind of going at this Abood case. So then what happened was there was this company called Janus that had like hired lawyers to get a particular case through, and they actually like requested to lose, and he noted this to Amy Coney Barrett. And so it's all about achieving a certain effect, essentially, to go after the strength of unions, and it's about bolstering the owner class, essentially, and corporations, businesses. Like they have all power over your lives, and the government or unions, they can't step in to help you in any case. So that's a pretty important thing there, and I think another important point to make there is Whitehouse illustrated how, again, like it's about kind of getting certain cases to achieve a desired effect, to enact this kind of principle, this doctrine over the law. So it's not always the case that it's just like naturally coming up through the courts, and then you go to appeals court and then you lose there, and then you go to the Supreme Court. It's not always the case that it's organic. It's oftentimes funded by big money. So it's a very complicated thing, and people don't really follow the Supreme Court as much, unfortunately. I just don't think, and for one thing, doesn't necessarily that's not the thing that motivates people to vote as much. I feel like, I mean, as was the case last time in 2016. I would say this time around, probably third party voting won't be as much of an issue, but again, it goes to show that people were not really that concerned with the Supreme Court, at least in the case of 2016. But let's go to the Chevron doctrine. This is a pretty important one too. So, just briefly, before I go on to read the Washington Post, I'll explain what the Chevron doctrine is briefly. It's basically, if you were to pass like a law, if Congress passes a law saying we want to have clean water, we want to clean up our water as best as possible, Congress, they're not scientists usually, so they don't know how to actually go about doing that and cleaning up the water. So they're writing legislation and they're basically like deferring that authority to the EPA, as in this case, like to a federal agency that has expertise in that particular area. And you could apply that to a lot of different issues, but in the case of the environment, yeah, I mean, like, that's a pretty important thing for the EPA to be able to do its job, that they have some level of authority. Because if it's all just dependent on whatever Congress writes, like, really to the letter of the law, and like you can't go beyond the legislation whatsoever, it's just like that is not viable. That doesn't work. It's not practical, because how are you going to ensure that it's actually based in science? And you look at the data that's showing that there's a lot of pollution going on, especially under Trump, as things have been rolled back, and waterways can get polluted like crazy. So you have to allow the EPA to do their job, and it's just like the Republicans, like, to them, what's more important is that the businesses and corporations just have the freedom to do what they want, and that capital reigns supreme. That's just what it is. But okay, so this is from Washington Post. I think it highlights things in a really good way. So, Democrats will focus on Barrett's views on abortion and Obamacare, but Barrett's impact on environmental law may be just as significant. One of the biggest potential impacts of Barrett's presence on the High Court would be on who has standing to bring an environmental lawsuit. While serving on the appellate court covering Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin, Barrett wrote the majority opinion in at least 2 cases, including one brought by a park preservation group against the construction of Barack Obama's presidential center in Chicago, denying opponents standing in court to sue. Her more restrictive view on who has standing is in line with that of the conservative icon Scalia. Barrett was a clerk for Scalia in 1999 when the Supreme Court agreed to hear what would turn out to be a major ruling written by Ginsburg that opened the door for environmental groups to sue industrial polluters. Ginsburg's decision in Friends of the Earth versus Laidlaw Environmental Services greatly expanded the ability of citizens sickened by pollution to seek a remedy from the courts. Scalia was only one of 2 justices to dissent in the 2000 case. It was a huge defeat for Justice Scalia, said Robert Percival, a professor of environmental law at the University of Maryland, said, adding, I'm convinced that Judge Barrett would take us back to pre-Laidlaw days. There are signs Barrett could help cement the Trump's administration's environmental rollbacks for decades. She signed onto a majority opinion in 2018 reversing a lower court decision saying 13 acres of Illinois wetlands were subject to protection under Clean Water Act from being developed by a home builder. At the center of that lawsuit was the Obama administration's expansion of which bodies of water are regulated under the law. Claiming the rule has cost jobs, the Environmental Protection Agency under Trump has sharply limited federal protection for waterways. And then just to finish that up, there was another part of it. One more important precedent for, and this is about the Chevron deference. One important precedent for the environment that the more conservative court may whittle away is Chevron deference. The doctrine established in 1984 requires courts to yield to agencies' interpretations of the law when statutes are ambiguous. Some conservative judges, particularly Justice Neil Gorsuch, have sought to weaken that precedent, which was crucial for the Obama administration's efforts to combat climate change using the Clean Air Act, like I just said. Barrett isn't entirely opposed to deferring to federal agencies. In a dissent this year, Barrett deferred to the Trump administration after the Department of Homeland Security issued rules making it harder for immigrants who have relied on public assistance to get permanent residency. So it's like, I love how they throw that in there. It's like, she's like, yeah, of course you'll use deference in that case when it's against immigrants. Like, okay. Still, Bernick said his expectation remains that she will join in Justice Gorsuch's successful thus far project in taking the bite out of Chevron. And Bernick was this guy from Georgetown Law who was like a constitutional guy who said he studied Amy Coney Barrett's scholarship. So I'm assuming he knows a lot about her. So, look, at the end of the day, this is all about projects over decades of time, really, where people try to shape the country one way or another. I mean, this is the most powerful court in the land. And I just wish we would stop pretending that it's just like there's a kind of greater cause like in this middle where it's like, oh, we're striving for this greatness and we're not being partisan one way or the other, like right wing or left wing. Like, you are being an activist on the court. Because it feels like ridiculous to even have to explain this. But people have different views of the world, and it's like, you're going to come away either right wing or left wing. To act like you can't, that it's actually possible to completely divorce your political opinions from how you interpret the law, and it's like you're not reading anything into that in how you decide in a case. Like, I feel like that is just absurd. It's like you can talk about, like, yeah, it's like as long as whatever the legislation is, like, if it's not contradictory with the Constitution, then that's fine. But I feel like that's just not what goes on. It's not as simple as just like, oh, okay, as long as it doesn't go against the Constitution, then it'll be fine. People just essentially read into how the process should be rectified. It's essentially like passing the responsibility onto Congress. And so it's really kind of convenient for the court to just be like, well, it's like we shouldn't decide in this matter, so we're just gonna like let the previous court ruling stand, or like we'll go back to Congress and they have to make things better in that way. It's always a very narrowly tailored thing with the Supreme Court. That's what they do. I mean, just because it's about making sure all of our laws are consistent with the Constitution. And when we're talking about potentially going against precedents that have been in this country for 50 years with Roe v. Wade, or with Chevron, I believe that was in the 70s as well. It's just... to even have this conversation because like it's we see the proof. We saw that Barrett signed on to these ads that are anti-abortion, anti-Roe v. Wade. It shouldn't even be a question. Like to act like it's up in the air, and it's like, oh, she might actually do the right thing. She might go according to the precedent, and it's like not gonna read into her own views into the situation. Just I feel like that's so naive, and it's amazing because it's just like like you had Dianne Feinstein on the issue of severability. She was like, oh, it's like I liked Amy Coney Barrett's grasp of severability. I think that was good. Like, good job resisting. It's like, this is why it's like they shouldn't even have gone to the hearing. Like, it's like they're practically half agreeing with this person, and I bet you some Democrats will vote for Amy Coney Barrett. I already read Mitt Romney is going to, so I think we should drop this whole like never Trump Republicans and be like, oh, like they're so brave for going against Trump. Like they're gonna go along with whatever he has to do most of the time, anyways. It's just crazy. I feel like the Democrats don't know how to fight. They don't know how to make an argument, and the only reason they're even doing so well in terms of the election right now, I feel like it's just because Trump isn't. It's imploding. He got well from COVID. It seems like that didn't really seem to stop him much. But at the same time, just I think that people are not in a good place right now, and whether you think it's right, whether you think it's fair to blame Trump for the pandemic and all that, like people like it's kind of like he's an easy boogeyman to blame and like cast all your problems on. And it's like, yeah, there's a lot of merit to that. I think there would have been a pandemic even if Trump wasn't president, but we could have handled things a lot better. Probably we could have. I don't think the Democrats would have done what Europe did and nationalized people's wages and paid for them to not go out. Essentially, that's what we should have done. But look, at the end of the day, I think people, it's a referendum on Trump. Like it or not, that's what this election is about. And so if Biden underperforms, that certainly speaks a lot to Biden, because like how could you underperform under these like dreadful circumstances of like you're in the middle of a pandemic and a depression. It's like if you can't beat Donald Trump now, like the Democratic Party is done if they can't beat Trump now. And then at the same time, it's like, yeah, if the Democrats win, they're not going to listen to the left. Like I know that they're going to go back to being like moderate Republicans. Excuse me. It's like they're barely even hesitant. I'm sorry, like I can't speak today. I'm just too much. But they don't back up the Green New Deal. They're not okay with even saying the words practically. So I just don't know what to say anymore. It's just with the situation, the election is looking better, but with the makeup of the court changing as I think it will, because I think that she'll probably get in when this comes to a vote. I think Amy Coney Barrett will be confirmed probably. It's going to have a profound impact in the future for any kind of progressive legislation. So best thing we can do, I guess, is just focus on the issues again. You got to keep focused on the issues that affect people's material needs and how you can make things better for people. And I haven't seen that enough from the Democrats by and large. I mean, oh my gosh. Pelosi's interview with Wolf Blitzer on CNN. I mean, that was exactly the wrong thing to do, and that helps Trump win. That obviously helped make Pelosi look way more out of touch, and I'm not saying more out of touch than Trump, but just like it's like wow, it's like you really think that you're representing us, Pelosi, when like it's like you can't even fight for basic things. So I wish the Democrats the best. You know, it's just I've not had faith, and everything I've seen thus far from their strategy is not giving me much hope. It's just the situation on the ground is that Trump seems to be losing. So I think that's just due to the fact that we're in a failed state essentially. Neither option is really good, but people pretty much acknowledge we're in a really shitty situation right now.